This is RANE's Essential Geopolitics podcast, your primary source for quick and reliable geopolitical risk intelligence. I'm Emily Donahue. Welcome aboard. The United States has eased some sanctions on Venezuela in hopes it might further negotiations between President Nicolas Maduro's government and the opposition. This as both also agreed recently to a UN-managed plan for the country's poor. Is it possible that long-stalled negotiations could yet yield some results? Carmen Colosi is here with answers. She's RANE's Latin America analyst. Carmen, it's great to have you back.
Thank you so much for having me, Emily.
Can you please provide some context for the negotiations between Venezuela's government and the opposition interim government? And please don't hesitate to go deep into the details.
Sure. So around this time last year, negotiations in Mexico City between the government and the opposition fell apart. This was in part due to the U.S. extraditing Venezuelan citizen Alex Saab, but also it was part of a broader strategy from our point of view, from the Maduro administration, to really kind of evade the negotiation process, really as a tactical measure to ensure that the Maduro administration would continue to have, political control in the country. So fast forward just a couple months, and then you see the Russia's invasion of Ukraine and what that did to oil markets and the knock-on effects from that. And we saw the Biden administration really kind of pushing for a variety of different countries to increase oil exports. One of the countries that, was kind of floating around was, of course, Venezuela, for its, massive oil reserves. When we look at this, it's definitely a little bit more complicated for the Biden administration to free up oil and gas exports from Venezuela, primarily because there haven't been significant exports since 2019 due to U.S. sanctions. So in order for the U.S. to really kind of be able to credibly relax its sanctions, it would have to get some political concessions from the Maduro administration. Since Russia's invasion of Ukraine, we've really seen the Biden administration kind of hinting and prodding at the Maduro administration in Venezuela, pushing the Maduro administration to reignite negotiations. Now, we've seen this come in a variety of different incentives. A few of them I'll just list out are, the potential to have a UN-backed, humanitarian aid fund for Venezuela, which would give, around $3 billion of Venezuela's frozen funds abroad a purpose and a use in Venezuela today. The second is that, the U.S. has really kind of floated the idea of having Chevron, a U.S. Oil and gas company, to, restart some of its operations in Venezuela. So what we saw happen in late November was that the U.S. relaxed some sanctions on the Venezuelan oil and gas sector, specifically allowing U.S. oil and gas company Chevron a limited operating license in Venezuela to begin to export some of Venezuela's oil. Again, this is a very small quantity of oil. But what that means is that simultaneously, the Maduro administration also agreed to restart Mexico City negotiations, which is really, a mechanism for the opposition to pressure the Maduro administration into giving some political concessions ahead of 2024 Venezuelan elections.
Given everything that you've just laid out, is there a remote scenario that would see negotiations actually bring any results?
So the short answer is no. The reason for that is that the Maduro administration is in a relatively strong position right now. The opposition coalition is seeing a lot of infighting. There's a lot of discussion as to who will lead up the opposition in 2023. So the opposition is very weak. The U.S. is in many ways catering to the Maduro administration, trying to increase the amount of, oil exports that the U.S. Does receive from other countries around the world, including from Venezuela. So those are two elements. And the final one is that the domestic situation in Venezuela is not as bad as we've seen during previous negotiation attempts. There's no widespread uprisings. There's no significant threat to the Maduro administration currently. And a lot of that is because of things like the dollarization of the Venezuelan economy. But overall, there's just not that many triggers for, domestic uprising that could really seriously threaten the Maduro administration. And because of that, the Maduro administration is very likely to give some political concessions during these negotiations. What these smaller political concessions could look like are things like reinstating opposition party cards. Right now, only the socialist faction is able to have a party card, or releasing some political prisoners. But again, these are going to be very small concessions in order to say, hey, we're continuing with these negotiations. What the Maduro administration is not likely to do is they are not likely to give any significant political concessions that would in any way potentially lead to them losing power during 2024 general elections. And because of that, we're not likely to see these negotiations really continue, to a point where that we could see some substantial change in Venezuela over the course of the next, say, 18 months.
So if that's the case, and the United States in particular doesn't get what it wants, well, what does that bode for the oil and gas sector in Venezuela?
So there's a few different aspects here. The first is that when negotiations eventually do fall apart, the U.S. will almost certainly have to, for political reasons, revoke Chevron's, limited oil and gas license and kind of reinstate, a solid sanctions regime. That's one element. The second is that we're just not likely to see Venezuela's oil and gas sector really come online in any sort of significant way in the mid to long term, especially considering that if Maduro is likely to win the 2024 general elections, for whether or not that's legitimate, that's something that we'll almost certainly see the Biden administration and subsequent administrations really continue a kind of hard line stance on Venezuela's oil and gas sector.
Thank you, Carmen.
Thank you so much for having me.
Carmen Colosi is a Latin America analyst with RANE. You can read her analysis of Venezuela's complex challenges in Worldview. That's RANE's geopolitical intelligence solution. With interactive graphics, RANE's exclusive global risk monitor, key forecast questions, and global threat monitoring, security professionals rely on RANE Worldview. Sign up for a free trial today at ranenetwork.com. I'm Emily Donahue. Thanks for listening.